June the 4th, 2026. The Khumbu Icefall, Everest. A garbage collection team found a 52-year-old guide crawling down the ice on his hands and knees, missing for 6 days, and almost no one had gone looking. Hold on to that, because it only makes sense at the very end. While that man fought for his life inside a crevasse, the mountain above him was setting every record in climbing history. Not one record, not two. 1,008 successful summits, the most ever logged, beating the old high of around 900. 494 permits issued, $7.2 million in royalties, 270 people on the summit in a single day. By every number a tourism office counts, this was the greatest season Everest has ever seen. But the part I find most extraordinary is that none of it was one event. It was a chain reaction that began weeks earlier, far from the summit. This is the brutal update on the Everest 2026 season that asks for a change. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. To understand why 1,008 summits is such a staggering figure, you have to understand what it replaced. For most of the last decade, a strong season meant somewhere around 800 or 900 people reaching the top across 2 full months of climbing. This spring beat that by more than 100 summits. Think about what that actually looks like on the ground. Imagine the busiest single morning the mountain had ever seen. And then imagine that morning repeating again and again for nearly 2 weeks straight. The weather cooperated, the fixed ropes held, the forecasts lined up. And yet, when one of the most respected analysts of the mountain looked at the raw data, his verdict was almost deflating. That underneath the dramatic headlines, this was, mechanically, a fairly normal season behaving in a fairly normal way. That detail matters more than it sounds. Roughly 80% of all those summits happened in a tight window between May the 17th and May the 26th, exactly the way they always have. The mountain did not change. The weather did not gift anyone a miracle. So if the climbing itself was ordinary, why were the numbers so far from ordinary? Because behind every one of those 494 permits is a person who spent years and, in many cases, tens of thousands of dollars to be standing in that line. For you and me, a crowded trail sounds like an inconvenience. For someone who has trained for 3 years and remortgaged a piece of their life to be there, a crowded trail is the difference between the summit and going home with nothing. Every one of those climbers was carrying that weight up the mountain. And they were not all there for the same reasons. Some were paying clients on commercial teams, trusting a guide to keep them alive. Some were elite athletes chasing records that had stood for decades. One of them, a 31-year-old man, had no sponsors, no social media, and reportedly lived out of a van. Another had spent the off-season planning to break a speed record that had survived more than 20 years. And underneath all of them, doing the invisible work that makes the entire economy possible, were the Sherpa guides and rope fixers who go up first, carry the most, and are seen the least. Every story I am about to tell you grew out of the same crowded mountain. The records and the near tragedy were not separate events on separate slopes. They were the same season, viewed from 2 very different positions in the line. So, how does an ordinary mountain produce an extraordinary year? The answer starts in February, and it has nothing to do with Nepal. Everest has 2 main routes to its summit: the South Col route, which rises out of Nepal, and the northern route, which climbs from Tibet on the Chinese side. For decades, those 2 doors have shared the traffic between them. This spring, China closed its door. The northern side was shut to expeditions for reasons that were never publicly announced. No statement, no explanation. Just a closed border and a season's worth of climbers who suddenly had nowhere else to go. Every team, every athlete, every paying client who had hoped to climb from the north was funneled onto a single route through Nepal. By the first week of May, everything was aligned. The window was opening. The teams were ready. The mountain had quietly been set up to break. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what that closure actually did in plain terms. Picture a major bridge into a city with 2 crossings. For years, traffic split roughly between them. Now, imagine that one morning, without warning, one of those crossings is sealed shut, and every single car that was going to use it is poured onto the remaining bridge instead. The bridge does not get wider. The number of cars does not shrink. They simply stack up on the one route that is left. That is what happened on the South Col. The same number of ambitious people, the same narrow band of good weather, the same single line of fixed ropes, but now with the North Side's share of humanity added on top. The crowding was not bad luck. It was arithmetic. And the records, the danger, and the heroics all came out of that same equation. May the 20th. 270 people on the summit in a single day. That is the day the funnel reached its peak, and it is also the day the records began to fall in earnest. A runner named Tyler Andrews set a blistering new speed mark from base camp to the summit, 9 hours and 55 minutes, beating Lhakpa Gelu, Sherpa's 2003 record of 10 hours, 56 minutes, and 46 seconds by more than an hour, and setting a round-trip mark of 16 hours and 32 minutes on top of it. A 31-year-old skied down from the summit on May the 19th, days after skiing the neighboring peak of Lhotse, without bottled oxygen and without Sherpa support, a feat of self-reliance the mountain has almost never seen. The board was filling with names. The season looked golden. Quick heads up before the part of this story that matters most. Every week I drop a new update on these mountains that you will not find anywhere else. If that is what you are here for, please subscribe. Now, back to it, because the records you just heard came with footnotes that the headlines mostly skipped. That speed record, both the runner and the man whose record he broke used supplemental oxygen, and the runner had originally announced he would go without it. The late switch created real confusion about whether the climbing community would even recognize the mark. Confusion sharp enough that one elite alpinist publicly compared climbing with oxygen to riding an electric bike. And that ski descent, remarkable as it was not the first time anyone had skied Everest without oxygen. It was the first time anyone had done it completely unsupported. The records were real. They were also more complicated and more contested than a single number can ever capture. And then there is the man on the ice. His name is Hillary Dawa Sherpa, 52 years old, a working guide. On May the 29th, after Summit Day, he became separated from his client and vanished. What he survived in the days that followed is almost difficult to say out loud. He fell into a crevasse. He lived through avalanches. He chewed ice to stay hydrated and ate the scraps of chocolate left in his own pockets. 6 days. His clients, a Pole who had turned back and a Briton who had summited, were already off the mountain. His family, told nothing, had begun his funeral. When that garbage collection team finally found him crawling down the icefall, he was airlifted to a hospital in Kathmandu, alive against every reasonable expectation. He came home. But the question his survival raises is one this whole sport has been avoiding for years. When you lay the sequence of events in order, a clear and uncomfortable picture begins to form. According to reporting from inside the guiding community, the search for Hillary Dawa did not begin in earnest until he had already been missing for around 5 days. The rescue flight that finally brought him out was reportedly organized by a separate company only after his own family reached out. And the outfitter he had been working for is alleged to have never told that family their employee was even missing. One elite rope fixer put it bluntly to a reporter: if a Western client had gone missing, the mountain would have mobilized within hours. There is a name for the dynamic that produces a delay like that, and it came from inside the industry, not outside it: the treatment of local labor as expendable. That is the open loop from the very first seconds of this video. And that is its answer. The same season that set every record also let one of its own workers crawl off the mountain alone. That contrast is the real story of this spring, and it is why the season cannot simply be filed under success. The mountain that produced 1,008 summits and a string of world records is the same mountain on which several people lost their lives. The exact figure varies between sources, with one season wrap-up counting 5 lives taken on the slopes themselves. The records and the deaths and the near miss all sit on top of the same crowded route, fed by the same closed border, sold to the same growing line of people who want their turn. I do not say any of that to diminish what the climbers achieved. They are serious professionals who did genuinely hard things in a genuinely dangerous place. I say it because a season this big forces a question the sport has spent a long time not answering. Who exactly is this mountain for? And who pays the price when it gets this crowded? Nepal, for its part, has noticed. A new tourism bill is working its way through the country's parliament, and it would change who is even allowed to attempt Everest. The headline requirement is that climbers would first have to summit a 7,000-meter peak inside Nepal before being granted an Everest permit. The same bill would raise the permit fee from $11,000 to $15,000. As of now, it has only cleared one chamber of the federal parliament. It still needs the lower house and the president's signature before any of it takes effect. And a reference to it applying from 2027 is a target, not a certainty. Not everyone is convinced it will help. One prominent expedition operator argues that a serious 6,500-meter peak anywhere in the world might prepare a climber better than ticking a bureaucratic box on a specific Nepali summit. The debate is just beginning. So, here is the verdict. The 2026 Everest season did not become a record-breaking spectacle and a quiet near tragedy by accident. It became both because a single closed border funneled a record crowd onto one route, and the system underneath that crowd valued some of its people far more than others. If China had kept the northern side open this spring, do you think the records would still have fallen the way they did? Or do you think the danger on the South Col would have been cut in half? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.